Shalom WJC family. Time for our weekly Torah Talk. This week in Shul we will be reading Parshat Mishpatim, really a civil law code that comes after the revelation at Sinai. Actually, in maybe a bit of a zag here, want to talk about the wisdom Judaism brings us with regard to grief. And it comes from this part of the Torah, from the idea, the Parsha starts, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. And these are the ordinances that you shall place before them. Now, this comes immediately after the revelation at Sinai, and a command about how you should be modest, how the Kohanim, the priests, should be modest when they come to make sacrifices. So the rabbis ask, why is this piece about sacrifices placed just next to this Ve'ela Mishpatim? These are the laws. This is the civil legal code you should place before them. And the rabbis deduce from the juxtaposition, even though it's from last week's Parsha to this week's Parsha, of course, those separations were put in much, much later. And so the rabbis deduce from this juxtaposition that, in fact, not only are the sacrifices mentioned right next to the civil legal code, but that the court, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Judaism, of Rabbinic Judaism at least, should be placed on the Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, within the precincts of the temple itself. And it's a beautiful idea that, the religious life of the community cannot survive if it's not a just community. That's what the rabbis are making out of this. And I think it's a beautiful idea that law and justice need to pervade an entire society before people can really have a true religious experience, can have the safety, the connection, the sense of community and togetherness to have a true communal religious experience, a sacred space that they can call home. But I think there's something even more going on than that here. And that brings us back to this topic of grief. The Jews leave Egypt and they are what we would call, in modern parlance, institutionalized, right? They don't know how to live on their own. They often will complain, longing back for the days when the Egyptians took care of them, right? Better to be a slave than to have to try and fend for themselves. And we talk about the desert being a time to sort of find their freedom in their connection with God. And so they come through the Red Sea, they come to Mount Sinai, they have this massive revelation, this closeness. And then Moses goes up on the mountain and they get scared and they commit the sin of the golden calf. And suddenly, where there was this amazing intimacy of the apotheosis on Sinai, the revelation of God's self to the Jewish people, and a covenant sign and a connection made, suddenly God is gone. Until they build the tabernacle, that one-time presence going to a complete absence or nearly complete absence must have felt like such a deep loss. I can only imagine the grief compounded by their sin of the golden calf, by their betrayal, the shame that must have come with that. The people come to the end of Mount Sinai, they must be grieving. And it takes a whole conversation between Moses and God and a convincing before God agrees, okay, I'll dwell with the people in another way at the tabernacle. And so the tabernacle comes to represent the ongoing connection that's created at Sinai. Maybe that's why right at the end of the Revelation story, we get this law about the modesty of the priests and how the altar should be made. But the grief must still have been there. And so we turn the page and what do we get? Ve'ela Mishpatim. Here are the laws. What are the laws doing there? They're giving structure to a society so that in everything the Jewish people do, in the way that they manage the world post the revelation at Sinai, post the sin of the golden calf, which, by the way, we haven't read yet, We read it a couple of parshiot from now, but we know that those incidents are connected, right? Moses comes down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. He hears the ruckus of the golden calf. So we haven't read it yet, but presumably these laws were given, or perhaps these laws were given after the sin of the golden calf, that they are saying, here is the structure by which you can manage your grief. Here are principles and ideas and laws, rules by which even in your disappointment, even in your grief, you can find a way to move forward. And that, in fact, is Judaism's approach to grief. I'm thinking deeply about grief this week as we mourn as an entire people the death of the hostages Shiri Bibas and her 2 sons, Kfir and Ariel, those red-headed, orange-haired babies who we now know perished in Gaza. And the pain and the grief that I feel, and I know so many people are feeling because of that, it's almost too much to bear. And what does Judaism teach us when we are feeling this kind of grief? You can't wave a wand and make the grief go away. You can't take some pills and take the edge off. No, we have to experience the grief, but there's structure for experiencing the grief. That's what our mourning customs are. That's why we have Shiva. That's why we have the Shloshim, the 30-day period of sort of in-between official mourning between the 7-day Shiva period and the 11 months, and then 11 months of saying Kaddish. What are we told to do? There's rules around Shiva. Sit low to the ground. Don't wear leather. There's rules around Shloshim. Don't hear live music. Don't shave. There's rules for the 11 months. Show up and say Kaddish at least once every day, if not at every service. And this gives a structure to our grief. It doesn't mean that when the rules end, we stop grieving. It doesn't mean that they magically make us feel better, but it just gives us a way to move forward in a world that doesn't look quite the way we think it's supposed to, that doesn't feel quite like it did before our loss. So too, I think as an entire Jewish people, as the loss of the last 500 and a few days becomes clear, as there's still some 70 hostages, more than 70 hostages in Gaza, many of whom even are like the Bibas family, will not come home alive. And as the magnitude of that hits us, and the grief and the horror of this last year and a half, we are also in need of this structure, in need of these trappings of community and the principles that make life worth living, that allow us to walk forward through the world. And so I wish you comfort as I am praying for comfort myself this week from the terrible news that we've received. And I hope that our tradition and this idea of giving structure to a world that seems so chaotic is something that we can all access and use. Not only is it the religious, quote unquote, the avodah mitzvot that gives us that connection, that ability to see something bigger than ourselves in the world and to move forward, but even the each and every day, living the life the way it was meant to be lived, according to the principles that God gives us to create a good community, a good structure, a place where everyone can feel safe and the world can be a better place, where people can strive for a better life for their kids than they had for themselves. All those things that we sometimes take for granted until suddenly it all starts to fall apart. May we find that structure again in the mitzvot. May we do mitzvot to help make that world better, to find our way of living a life that is worth living, that no matter what's going on around us, we can not only find the beauty and the holiness in the world, but help bring more beauty and holiness into the world. And may the world be a little less chaotic, and there be fewer things to grieve soon, speedily in our days. Amen, and Shabbat Shalom.